Hello, our historians, and welcome to our first lecture over Roman art, where before we can really get into the heart of Rome, we have to kind of look back at the Etruscans a little bit. And the Etruscans are really fascinating, so I think you guys are really going to enjoy them. So before we even get into, and this is kind of a little bit of the context of the Roman Empire and Roman art as well. So what we know today is Italy was not always Italy. So until the 1800s, what it was basically made up of was a bunch of independent little city states, all right? And Rome, what we know as Rome, was actually made up of the Latins right here in the kneecap, which is actually the language that they speak in Rome. So you'll notice that in terms of size, it really wasn't much. And it was kind of, easy to come in and take over this area that had such a prime location right there in the Mediterranean Sea. So up above it is Etruria, which we know today as Tuscany, in this beautiful area in Italy. So the Etruscan people were very good sailors. They were very good on the water. They liked to sail around and connect and trade with other places, especially in the Aegean Sea and in the Mediterranean. So what we're going to see happen is these guys sailed all the way down here to the bottom of the boot, which if you notice down here at the bottom used to be controlled by the Greeks. So it was actually a Greek city-state or area of what is today Italy. So this is very important because in having contact with the Greeks, the Etruscans, we're going to see a lot of evidence of they were highly influenced by Greek art. And because they adopted a lot of Greek culture. In fact, they took the Greek gods, the polytheistic gods, gave them different names, but did adopt them. They took the Greek Phoenician alphabet. These guys were also very, very good at building arches. So everybody kind of gives credit to the Romans for the arch. It wasn't actually them. It was the Etruscans who were able to build this. They were really good engineers. We also know that they came up with the concept of roads that the Romans are going to become so famous for. So like all roads lead to Rome. And even gladiator games may have been started by the Etruscans. So the Etruscans kind of get forgotten, which is probably because the Romans came in and just mangled them and wanted to make sure they were forgotten. But they're an important part of our art historical story. So what we know about the Etruscans is they are very into their polytheistic religion, but they're also into, just like Greece, they kind of adopted this idea of, yes, there are your religious buildings, but also your civic buildings. So things to serve the civilians. So just like they had the agora in Greece, the Etruscans are going to kind of adopt that idea as well. And because the Romans will take the Etruscans over and kind of absorb them, we're going to see that transfer into Rome. So the Etruscans are basically the bridge between what we're going to see in Greece and Rome. Now, we don't have, unfortunately, a lot of Etruscan art left. Mostly what we have left is what was underground, because the Romans will burn everything above ground that was Etruscan when they come in and take it over. Or it's stuff that the Romans had the Etruscans do for them, because the Etruscans are very, very good at bronze making. And so the Romans were really big fans of Greek art. So they would have the Etruscans create Greek art for them, like copies of Greek art. So that's why we see a lot of Greek arts in Rome, because the Etruscans would actually copy it for them. So if you look right here, this is a copy of a picture of a model of the Temple of Minerva, which would be Athena. So if you're looking at this right here, this is the Roman version of this, but it's not actually Roman, it's Etruscan. So looking at this, what similarities and differences can you see to a Greek temple such as the Parthenon? So just take a second and kind of jot down similarities and differences. Like, how can you see that Greek influence, but what can you see being a little bit different? So going back here, I thought I had this here, right? So I don't. So we'll go on from here. We don't actually have, the reason that you're looking at this little model right here is because, again, when the Romans get fed up with the Etruscans and run them out, they literally destroy everything above ground. They don't keep any of it. They have enough Greek influence to look at on their own. They don't need the Etruscans. So there's really nothing in terms of writing or history or anything that's left behind. What we mostly have is underground in their burial sites or their necropoli or their cities of the dead, which were literal cities underground where there were streets running through it and little, tombs that looked like houses pointing onto the streets, just like driving down a regular city street. So we would see, and one of the things we know about the Etruscans is they cremated their dead. So they didn't necessarily bury, but they would bury the ashes. And so right here, this little thing that you're looking at, that's actually an urn to hold ashes. And looking at it, you can see that it's got the Greek columns with the Corinthian tops. We've got the pediment up there at the top with the pediment sculpture. So we definitely see that evidence that they had some contact with the Greeks and were adopting their styles. And the reason we know that is because of a Roman architect named Vitruvius, who fortunately, before Rome came and burnt everything down, Vitruvius actually sat down and recorded the Etruscan architecture, which helps us to see that influence from Greece and helps us know that the Etruscans were actually that bridge. So here's some differentiations though. So this is kind of a little color recreation of the temple that you saw 2 slides ago. So a little bit different with the Etruscans. They don't have a lot of marble available, and where you are is who you are. So we're not going to see a lot of marble structures with them, but we do see a lot more of mud brick and wood. So because it's not marble, we're going to see a little bit more of a simple design. So they would only, for this, they're much more practical than the Greeks. The Greeks would have steps going up to the Parthenon on all sides of it. So you could go up to look at the columns and the outside walls. The Etruscans are much more practical. They only put the entrance in the front. So there's only one set of steps, and that's in the front. And they would elevate the building up to be higher, to kind of show a little bit of status. So kind of like the propylae walking up to the Parthenon, but it's not the building itself. The Parthenon doesn't sit up higher. This one actually does. They would also, instead of putting, this is an Etruscan thing, instead of putting the sculpture in the pediment right here in the triangle, they put their sculpture on the roof, which allowed them a little bit more freedom in terms of how they could make their sculptures look, because they had a lot more space to work with because they were on the top. And one of the really good materials that the Etruscans worked with was terracotta, which is kind of a baked clay. And we see that covering kind of all over these temples, which kind of gave it that cool painted effect. Now we do see a new order of columns being developed by the Etruscans. So they did take the idea of the Greek columns, but they kind of put their own spin on it. And these were called Tuscan columns, which look Doric, but they're not fluted. So what that means is they're smooth all the way around instead of having those grooves in them that you would normally see on like Greek columns. And they put a base on the bottom of the columns, which wasn't actually done in Doric columns in Greece. So this is that Tuscan or Etruscan order. So here is one of the most interesting things that we have that we found from the top of the Temple of Minerva. So this right here is actually Apollo, and Apollo would help with bringing the sun up every morning. So that was one of his jobs, all right, as a Greek god. So this was actually put on top of the Temple of Minerva, this very dynamic, like almost in movement sculpture, which is not something we saw in Greece until Hellenistic. But this, if you look at it, is clearly, you've got some influence from Greece, but it's kind of a mix. You've got the archaic smile, which is showing that they would have encountered archaic Greece, but they've got the wet drapery look to it, which shows movement, like it would have been fluttering, you know, in the sun as his chariot was moving, because it was believed his hands were out, like holding onto his chariot as he's bringing the sun up. So it's almost like the statue itself isn't just the sculpture, but the space around it is in the sculpture, like the wind that would have been blowing this. So it's probably not the wet drapery look of Phidias, but it's this advanced idea by the Etruscans, even before the Greeks were doing it, of making the entire scene part of it. That we, even though we can't see the wind, we can see the wind blowing his hair back, and we can see it blowing back, you know, his robe that he's wearing. So here's another thing about the Etruscans. They're much more practical. Like I said, they're not about nudity. This god wouldn't have been nude, so therefore they're not going to show him nude. They're going to show him in a toga and in drapery. And what's really cool about this is if it was on top of the roof line of this temple, it would have had the sky behind it, almost like a backdrop. So therefore it really looks like here's Apollo with his, you know, reins in his hand, riding his chariot, bringing the sun up. So it's almost like the Etruscans were way ahead, because we know they must have been influenced by the archaic period, by the way that the face looks, because it's clearly that archaic smile. But they've got that late classical movement, and they've got the Phidias look to it, even though it's way before Phidias. So, I mean, they were really, really kind of advanced for what they were doing at the time. So here's the Temple of Minerva, and you can see the roofline sculpture. And up here is where that statue of Apollo would have been, as he's driving his chariot, kind of like, you know, riding and bringing the sun up, which you can see right here in the middle of how his hands probably would have looked, as far as we know. This is how it would have been reconstructed. This is kind of the remains of where such a temple would have been. And you can definitely see that elevated appearance to show a little bit more importance to the gods. And you can see here the floor plans. They've got 2 rows of columns in the front instead of just 1, whereas Greece and the Parthenon would have just had 1 to walk back in. But you can see the pediment, and you can see the inside where the cult statues would have been. So the Etruscans, being as powerful as they are, eventually they're going to go and take over. So the Etruscans are right up here in the yellow. They're going to go down and take over the Latins who live in Rome. And whenever they do this, they're going to establish themselves as kings there. But eventually, the Romans are going to get fed up with that. And they're going to be like, you know what? We want to overthrow you. We want to rule ourselves. And when they do overthrow the Etruscans, the Romans decide they don't want to have a king. They don't want to have an emperor. They want to kind of take a page out of Greece's book and become a republic, a democratic republic, which basically is you get elected to represent other people. So represent different districts like we have now. We were basically the first democratic republic since Rome. So that's going to be an important part of who Rome is, obviously. But as Rome started to grow in power under this organized government where they had somebody in charge of the military and they had their own standing army, they start to expand out and take over Etruria, or the Etruscan area, and basically were determined to rewrite history and erase the Etruscans and get rid of them, because it's like, we want to forget that you guys ever ruled us. So they went in and wiped out everything above ground that we have. So fortunately for us, we do have what was left below ground for the Etruscans. And so underground, we have these elaborate necropoli, or cities of the dead. And what we can tell from looking at these necropoli is, yes, there was some influence from Greece, but we're also going to see a little bit of influence from Egypt in the way that things appear. And that could be because, A, they were sailors, but it could also be because Greece was influenced by Egypt during the Archaic period, which is when the Etruscans would have encountered the Greeks. So through the Greeks, we're also going to get a little bit of Egyptian appearance as well. So again, I kind of mentioned this already, that cremation for the Romans, especially in the Etruscans, was much more prominent than in other areas. So we know Egyptians buried, Greeks were primarily cremation, but there were some burials as well. It's not until Christianity really becomes popular, where the body was believed to be needed for the resurrection, that we see burial become a much more common practice. So in the Etruscans, we see a large amount of cremations and crematory remains that are put into sarcophagi, and they're going to use the materials that are around them, such as terracotta, which was very popular there, to create these things. So we can tell a lot about the life of the Etruscans through the way that they honor their dead. And they would, if you look at this right here, it looks like somebody's house. Like, you've got things on the wall, you've got tools on the wall, you've got shields, you've got gardening tools, you've got stuff for horses. These mausoleums, basically, where entire families would be buried and, you know, put their urns were put in there with their ashes, were basically like little homes. And the appearance is that it seems like the Egyptians, that they could take their things with them into the afterlife, because the more elaborate the tomb, the more stuff that they had with them, which could show wealth. So during this time when Greece is encountering Egypt and this part of the world, that maybe those ideas of burying with these, you know, possessions became very popular. So one of the coolest things we have in terms of preserving Etruscan art are their frescoes. So we've seen frescoes in the Aegean with the Minoans. We've seen them in Egypt. These guys love to paint on the walls of their tombs. And from everything we can see, Death to these people was not scary at all. It was a thing to be celebrated as a transition into another part of life. The afterlife looks happy. This right here is called the Tomb of the Diver because he's just having a good time jumping off a diving board, and it's more a continuation of life. And where the Egyptians were a little bit more somber about it, these guys were like, no, this is fun. We're going to party and have a really good time. This is another example. This is called the Tomb of Shields and Chairs in, Etruria. And you can see here, there are shields and chairs, and it looks like a home, and reclining couches, because just like the Greeks, and they would eat laying down. So therefore, you've got these places to lay down and relax and be a family, and the shields on the wall that would have shown victories for the family maybe. And then you would go into the next room and there'd be another room. So just kind of looks like a continuation of life, really. This is just another example of it. You can see here they are catching birds, fishing, they're out on the water, they're just having a really good time. And even the wall paintings look like they're painting into a pediment up here. So almost like they're painting onto the front of a temple a little bit. So this is the Tomb of the Leopards, and this is the one, or the Tomb of the Triclinium, which I'll explain in a second. So triclinium would be like this area for eating and relaxing in the home. And you can see that up at the top, they have a male and female leopard, which could show the fact that they've got gender equality here. Plus in this picture, we have males and females in this scene. And we know that because it looks very Egyptian in the fact that women are painted lighter and men are painted darker to denote the male and female sexes. They're dining together, and joining together in this eating. And a woman is offering an egg to this man, which could be a symbol of life after death and rebirth and hatching and coming from nothing, basically. So you've got this maybe celebratory feast in a triclinium because they were eating on these reclining couches where you would lay down while you eat and kind of discussing. So it's probably a either funerary feast or a celebratory feast. And you have these symbols of power up there at the top, the leopards, but it is male and female, which shows us something. And then also in the Tomb of the Triclinium, you have this crazy dance going on of the lighter skinned female and the darker skinned male, and they're dancing and celebrating, and they kind of mirror each other in the hands. So kind of yin and yang, life and death, completing each other kind of thing. I mean, this is a very different view of the afterlife than we've seen before. It's just very happy and celebratory instead of Egypt's very focused on making sure that you're happy in the afterlife. These guys didn't have to worry about being happy in the afterlife. It looks like they already are or were. So a triclinium is an ancient Roman dining table that probably came from also Egypt, because we think Egypt and Greece may have done this too, but they're laying down, they're eating, they're relaxing. So there's dancing, there's musical instruments in here. So was this a scene of life after death, or was it a funeral feast to honor the dead? They're wearing these laurel leaf crowns. I'm going to go back here so you can see this. So the laurel leaves. So my name's Lauren, and Lauren actually means destined for victory, which sounds cool until you realize my brother's name is Matthew, which means gift from God. So I don't think I got that good of a name anyway. But up here at the top, those laurel leaves, sorry, my lights just turned off, mean victory. So this could very easily mean victory over death. And if you know anything about the Romans, those are the crowns that they wore, is the laurel leaf crowns. So maybe that's something that they also adopted from the Etruscans. So this is an example of, so the Tomb of the Triclinium is on the AP exam. It's part of the 250. And so is this sarcophagus. All right. Now, we already saw in the Tomb of the Triclinium that men and women are eating together, that they are dining at the same time, that there's a male and female leopard. And we know they're influenced by Egypt, where women definitely had a better status than in most places, way better than in Greece. So could it be that Egypt almost had a little bit more influence on the Etruscans than did the Greeks? It's possible, but we do know there was Greek influence, especially archaic Greek, because if you look at this sarcophagi, you can see that creepy archaic smile on their face, and the braids that we would see in Koros boy. So you can see here, just looking at this, that these people are definitely Greek influenced, but Egyptian wise, she is serving him food, but she is also joined with him in this sarcophagus. Like, she's buried with him. It's a loving embrace. Maybe he was holding an egg, so that symbol of eternal life for both of them. And he's got his arm protectively around her, and she is feeding him. Now, obviously, this is not meant to look naturalistic, because is it realistic? Yes. Could people lay like this? Yeah. But naturalistic? No, because you'd have to like break your legs basically to lay like this. But it's this idea of what we view, especially from looking at this and also the tomb of the triclinium, that these people would have had relative gender equality in the Etruscan culture. So this sarcophagus, which is made of terracotta and is made of clay, you know, so very nicely, so you can mold and get a lot of detail, it looks like a reclining couch or bed, which is going to become a very common way for sarcophagi in Rome to look. They almost look a little bit like a bed, so a place of rest. And if you look down here on the bottom, you can see the top of what looks like an ionic column, which could have also been that Greek influence as well. So just to show you guys, here's another view of this. And what's another thing is images of women who are shown in Etruscans, they're real women. Like, they're not goddesses. They're not these people that you would never encounter. These were real women. And that's something that shows up in Etruscan art more than anywhere else we've seen at this point. Like, they are real human beings who obviously hold value and are being recognized not separate from their husbands, but alongside their husbands as a partnership. So this sarcophagus of the spouses, it does show us the Greek influence, because we know that the Greeks ate on these couches and Egyptians did also, and later the Romans will as well. And again, it's going to become very common to see sarcophagi look like these beds, like this does. So we see the skin tone differences and the hair color. We think that they use the same mold for the face, which also says something. They're not trying to differentiate between male and female here. They're okay with showing them as the same face, because it's not individual, it's the importance of them as a couple, which is kind of wild. So archaic Greek influence in the face and in the braids. We see inclusion of women, and yes, she's feeding him, but again, he's also protecting her. So much more of an equal status than we've seen anywhere else. If you compare this, for example, to the grave stela of Hegesso, that's a huge difference. And if you look here, this is a much later sarcophagus, so a burial object. And you can see here that the Romans, instead of using terracotta, will use a lot more stone, but they're going to kind of continue on this tradition of doing sculptures and sarcophagi, you know, these burial chambers that do look like those beds, those triclinium or reclining couches that we've seen in the tomb of the triclinium and also the sarcophagus of the spouses. All right, so I just think this is crazy. All right, this is kind of a fun fact. All right, but so you see this sarcophagus style that develops in the Etruscans, right? And that becomes part of Roman practice, to have a sarcophagi or burial chamber that looked like that kind of looked like one of those beds. So fast forward way later to the late 1700s and 1800s, and you have Napoleon, who is conquering all of France, but he's actually Italian, and his goal was to recreate a new Roman Empire. It's basically what he was going for, and why he was trying to create like the Arc de Triomphe in the middle of Paris on the Champs-Élysées, which was a giant victory arch that we'll talk more about later. So since the Romans adopted that style from the Etruscans, who probably adopted it from the Greek benches for eating and sleeping, and so did the Egyptians, Napoleon's final resting place looks like a Roman style or Etruscan style sarcophagus. This is what his tomb looks like. And if you guys live in St. Louis and you know the Eads Bridge, all right, so I actually work as a tour guide at Bellefontaine Cemetery in St. Louis, and we have James Eads, that's his tomb right up there. And James Eads, because he was this great, amazing engineer and built these bridges, which did have Roman style arches as kind of their base, so it kind of all goes around. he has a Roman style sarcophagus right here for his tomb, and he's actually buried underneath it in kind of an underground vault. But his marker is this like Roman style sarcophagus because he was such a great engineer, which actually is not truly Roman. They got it from the Etruscans, who were also incredible engineers. So just some fun facts for you. So the Etruscans were, as artists, they were good with terracotta. So we saw that with the Temple of Minerva. We've seen it with the sarcophagus of the spouses, but they were also excellent with bronze and metalworking. So that's one of the reasons why we have so many Greek copies of Greek art in Rome, is because the Romans would have the Etruscans do bronze working and metal work for them. And they would say, hey, we want you to copy Greek works of art in bronze using the way that the Greeks do it. But the Greek method, this wax bronze casting technique that they had, was lost over time. And so then we start seeing things being replaced into marble, since the way that the Greeks used to make the bronze kind of died out over time. So for example, this is one of the most famous Roman, we say Roman, bronze sculptures, and it's called the Capitoline Wolf. And it's the story of the two twin boys, Romulus and Remus, whose uncle was trying to kill them because they threatened his power. So their mother hid them, and they were saved and rescued by this wolf, all right, this she-wolf, and she raised them. And then Romulus and Remus grew up and overthrew their king. And then eventually Romulus killed Remus and became the first leader of Rome, and named it after himself. So this is this famous statue that everybody's like, oh, it's the statue of Rome. But actually, that was an Etruscan wolf. That was their technique and made it out of bronze. And then later they added Romulus and Remus to kind of adopt it and make it Roman. So just kind of a story that there's a lot of things that we take for granted and think, oh, that must be Roman, like their sarcophagi style and the arch and the roads and gladiator battles and sculptures that were like, oh, those must be Roman. Rome came up with them on their own, but they didn't. And even to recognize that they came from the Etruscans, who got their stuff from Greece and Egypt, if we leave that part out, we're leaving out a very important part of the story of how art came to look as it does.